need to make it clear.
Order. Well, I did not make the comment.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my evolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. She is from New Zealand's largest feminist blog, The Hand Mirror, commentator and blogger Julie Fairey. And he is one of Auckland's favourite sons, Waitemata and Golf Ward Councillor, direct from the Auckland Council, Mike Lee. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, what is the fallout from the Labour Party leadership meltdown? Issue 2, how can Auckland make housing actually affordable? And Issue 3, Key says he has left New Zealand in a better place than when he found it, which begs the question, how on earth did he find it? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. The civil war that has erupted by the dumping of David Cunliffe over the manufactured media leadership coup doesn't look like we'll end anytime soon, with the Newland LEC complaining about the way Whip Chris Hipkins defamed Cunliffe. Julie, Moira Coatsworth says the leadership coup was a media beat-up. David Shearer says it wasn't. What happened here?
I think there is definitely a media aspect to what has unfolded. There is disquiet within the party. I think that's fair.
Yep.
I don't think there's any disagreement about that, and a lot of that is driven by the fact the polls haven't lifted since they've got a new leader. They're not making traction, and I can understand that often, you know, you turn inward to resolve and discuss those matters. The media, I think, is quite fixated on the personality battles.
Totally.
There's a whole lot of really crucial stuff that happened at that conference, democratising the party, a really clear repudiation of the fourth Labour government.
Totally.
They actually put a statement in their policy platform that says the fourth Labour government breached Labour's core values. And people from the fourth Labour government voted for that. But it's not getting any coverage.
At all. None at
so
all.
There's definitely a media aspect to it, but there's also a political management aspect that is very real and is not media created. I think I feel a bit sorry for Shearer. There's been calls for him to be a bit more mongrel. Now that he has taken some action, people are saying he was too harsh. He kind of can't win either way. So it'll be interesting to see, I think, how it plays out over the next week in particular.
Does Patrick Gower asking Cunliffe 8 times in a row, are you going to vote against Shearer? Does that make a leadership challenge?
Well, I think we also need to remember that Patrick Gower is the reporter that said when Cunliffe came back from his holiday having shaved his beard off, that was an indication that the leadership was all on. So, you know, I don't think he's been helpful.
Mike, Brian Edwards claims it is an affront to democracy that Cunliffe be forced to declare who we would vote for 3 months from now in a secret ballot. Does this reflect well on Labour?
Well, it doesn't reflect well on the media either, actually. This is tabloid news, and it has been engineered to a degree by the news media, and it couldn't have happened at a worse possible time for the country, actually, because public support of National and confidence in National is faltering, and you know, people naturally at this time turn to the opposition. And the opposition was in the process of melting down, self-destructing. This is really, really bad news, not just for the Labour Party, but for the country as a whole.
Why do you think it is that John Key's poll ratings have been stubbornly high? I mean, he consistently rates higher than the National got on the election night itself. Why is that?
He's a successful guy. He's rich. You know, modern society puts great store on that. That's how I would explain it. He's an intelligent, competent person. I don't agree with his politics, which seem to be becoming more and more right-wing, but he's successful. But I think at the same time, people are getting fed up with him and his government. And at this time, you would look to Labour, and Labour is in the process of cannibalism right now, which is most unfortunate.
Julie, the modernisation of the Labour Party by allowing unions and members more say in the party should have been a celebration. How do you think rank and file members and affiliates are viewing this now?
I think my perception as someone who's sort of hung around on the fringes of the Labor Party for over a decade, that there's a camp of people who are very strongly supportive of Cunliffe, and they have very strong personal loyalty, and I have some respect for that actually. There is probably a camp who are pretty pro-Shearer, but there's a lot of people who are actually like, look, we've got a leader, can we just get on with this? Picking up on exactly what Mike's talking about, a really high level of frustration that they can't focus on the good things that came out of their conference. And there was some, I mean, I mentioned already the policy platform and the repudiation of the fourth Labor government. But also the very concept of a policy platform means you're no longer going to have a disconnection between caucus policy and the policy set by the party members. And that's a huge deal. I've heard for years from Labor Party members who would get frustrated going to conferences, putting up remits for progressive ideas, and MPs would stand up and say, you can vote this through if you like, but it won't be caucus policy. And now they've actually got the teeth in their structure that what the members set out and support, and affiliates are obviously a big part of that, will actually form the core of Labor's official parliamentary policy, what happens in opposition and, importantly, what will happen in government.
Yeah, and you need surely those kind of modernisations and democratisation of your party if it's going to work in the modern age, don't you?
Definitely. I think people expect now they're not as tribal about politics as they were, and they have a higher expectation that they will be involved and participate actively in a party if they're going to be members. We don't have a situation of mass membership of 20,000 people joining a party anymore. What we have is strong cores of people who want to be actively involved and have a say. And that's what they want to hear from their leadership too. It's not leadership that's on a different planet from them and is aspirational, but leadership that talks to them, that rolls up their sleeves, that gets their hands dirty.
Do you think Chris Hipkins went too far when in his public statements and the whipping situation and his criticisms of David Cunliffe? He's effectively suggested that David Cunliffe was responsible for disloyalty to Gough.
I think there's not a clear link between Cunliffe being disloyal to Gough. I think that's a speculation. In terms of Hipkins, he is the whip, and it is his job to enforce party discipline. And one of those tasks is around loyalty to the leader. So I actually think he was acting within his role. I think he's also probably expressed a lot of frustration that some people in the in the rank and file feel as well. And so I think it's been unhelpful that a lot of this has played out in public. Cunliffe's continual denial to actually back Shearer has played a part in that, and why that's happened in public, which is obviously not ideal. But then also Shearer's political management is an issue too. So
there's a dynamic in politics around leaders and successors. You're not leader for life. Was Nordmeyer especially loyal to Nash during the last months? Was Kirk loyal to Nordmeyer? And so on it goes. No, they weren't. But I mean, that has to be managed. You shouldn't be treated as a traitor or a Judas because you may have ambitions.
Do you think, Mike, the blogs were the main vehicle of frustration at the lack of political vision articulated by Shearer, but many Labour Party MPs wrote the blogs off as having no influence? Should the Labour Party, in your opinion, be concerned that it seems to have no social media strategy, especially in light of how Obama was able to use social media so effectively in this year's election?
Yeah, they do need a good social media strategy, but they also need a strategy. I mean, they have, and they have to work together to come up with one. They have party reforms which bring it into the 21st century. That's a great platform, but they need to start thinking past the neoliberal paradigm, which it still reigns very much in this country. We may have the odd reform here and there, but it's still a neoliberal world. And we've got to start thinking past that if we're going to solve the problems that New Zealand faces.
Question to both of you, who are the winners, who are the losers in all of this?
Well, I think the Labour Party membership broadly have been losers in this, and I think Mike hit it on the head before when he talked about this being a real loss for the country. I don't think it's irretrievable at all, and we've been here before. Now, how many coups have we all seen in our time in politics, failed or successful? And governments change and time goes on. So I mean, I really feel sorry for a lot of members who are the people who raise the money, who sign people up, who get signatures for the asset sales petition.
Sure.
All of that work, that they're not getting the leadership that they deserve.
Winners and losers here, Mike?
I believe the country is the loser,
yep.
and of course the Labor Party, and both protagonists actually. They've both been damaged, and they're going to have to repair it.
Yep. They need to call a ceasefire real quick, don't they? Predictions for February vote?
I think Shearer will continue to be the leader. I think Cunliffe has, in his actions at the conference, has actually pissed off a whole lot of people who previously weren't probably, you know, too polarised.
Yep. Prediction for the February vote?
I think status quo.
Yep.
For the reasons Julie mentioned.
Thank you, Petal. Moving on with issue 2. Apparently, Labor released a housing policy somewhere during the conference. How do we make housing affordable? Mike, I live in the CBD. I have for almost 2 decades, and the lack of 4-bedroom apartments is a major barrier to remaining. How do we urbanise Auckland and counter the quarter-acre sprawl if we don't have family apartments?
We absolutely need family apartments in the CBD. But what you have to appreciate, again, I'll make the same point, that Labor can come out with an exciting initiative like 10,000 houses, whatever, but it's in the context of a neoliberal paradigm. So there'll be all sorts of constraints around that, who builds them, at what price, and so on. And until we really have fundamental change, we're not going to really get to grips with the real problems besetting New Zealand right now, and they're getting worse. You know, housing really is an indicator of how unequal our society has become. There was a very interesting letter in the Herald this morning. A guy in 1976 bought a home for $30,000. At the time he was on $10,000 a year, so that was 3 times his annual salary. But I guess he had a state advances loan at a low interest rate, and you know, a second mortgage and all the rest of it, and he got there. But now to buy a house on the North Shore where he bought this place would probably cost about 8 or 9 times the average wage. So there's the cost of housing, but the other factor is that not only has the cost of housing gone up, and there are reasons for that I can talk about, but also the value of labour, wages have actually gone down, deliberately so.
That's right. So how do we get affordable housing in Auckland?
Well, I think, it's a long story, but what I would focus on, and not many people do, is the cost of building material. That's a taboo, because that's the Fletcher's monopoly, or the Fletcher Winstone's duopoly, which no one goes there. But I will. It's outrageous that we are being rorted and ripped off in the cost of building material in New Zealand, roads, houses, whatever. There's a major scam there. It is at the root of all the problems in Christchurch, and the horror the international insurance sector has expressed at the bill they were given, you know, for a town of 300,000 people. That's something that has to be tackled. You know, as I say, the other side of the equation, people's incomes, you know, they've been deliberately depressed. And again, there's no simple answer actually. We need a complete change from this neoliberal paradigm that has been ruling this country since 1984.
Julie, Labor's announcement for housing at $300,000 is effectively housing for the children of the middle classes. What about social housing to end the housing crisis that we're seeing in Glen Innes? What are we going to do for poor people?
I think that we have a very skewed market in New Zealand in terms of the way that rentals are, you know, really set up in a way that advantages the landlord. It's difficult to get long leases, for example, whereas overseas you will see situations where people get 99-year leases, for example, and that's not necessarily uncommon, and it means people have a stake in that community, in the building they're in, and so, you know, they will invest in the actual property itself. You know, they'll grow a garden, they'll paint the walls, they'll meet their neighbours. So there's some real issues there around the way the rental market is structured, and the expense of you know, housing just is too expensive, and as you've pointed out, Mike, I think that's primarily about wages being low. You know, people are not earning enough as opposed to housing costs. I mean, some of them are out of control, and Auckland's in a particularly strange situation. But in terms of social housing, It's really worrying, the new approach that Housing New Zealand is taking, that they have been in their core business, if you want to call it that, has been around people who housing has been their main problem. They haven't had a whole lot of other issues going on in their life that they've needed state assistance with. But now they're shifting away from supporting those people to supporting people who have multiple needs, who might have a disability, who might be on a benefit, who might have children who need special care. They're moving more into that end of the market where there had previously been a lot of third-party providers working on a range of needs for those people. So there's a big gap for people for whom the only issue they need assistance with from the state is actually the cost of housing.
Mike, the Greens have been highly critical of Chinese investors who are buying up housing in New Zealand and inflating the prices to pre-bubble bursting levels. Are we in danger of having a generation of New Zealanders grow up as tenants in their own homes, in their own country?
Yeah, I think we are, and I think it's unfair for the Greens really to single out the poor old Chinese investors.
Indeed.
The Greens have some issues with China and the Chinese that they need to work through, and it's a little bit of a stain on their pure liberal.
You think
souls.
it borders on xenophobia?
They are. I believe personally that they could be a little bit more tolerant of the way things are done in China. The way not everyone thinks the same way as white middle class liberals.
Sure.
But if they're blaming the housing problem on Chinese, they're sadly astray. The housing problem is our fault, New Zealand's fault. We went down that path, and as I say, it's a real indicator of inequality. We have a much more unequal society than we had at the time of the welfare state, and when the Labour Party and the Labour governments, those first 2 and 3 Kirk governments, were in their heyday.
Julie, Housing Minister Phil Heatley tried to upstage the Labour announcement by promising 600 of the new 3,000 Hobson Point houses would be affordable at $400,000. Auckland needs more than $400,000 houses, doesn't it?
Yes.
Where's the government going? I mean, what are we actually seeing here from Key?
Ultimately, I don't know that they particularly care about this issue.
Really?
Everything that they've been doing shows, what's been happening in Glen Innes, their approach to housing, and also the pressures that they've been trying to put on Auckland Council around the unitary plan, around sprawling rather than responsible intensity, tends to show, I think, that they don't really see this as a problem that needs resolving for the poor at all.
So their focus, you think, is more on the developers?
I think definitely.
And the land bankers.
And the land bankers?
I mean, we have, in our community, there's been quite a bit of land banking by a developer. And, we have people crying out for space. We have people who are tarping in their decks, living in garages in our area.
Wow.
And we've got to fit another 20,000 people in. Now, if we want to move to some responsible, high-quality, medium-density housing, the problem we have is some of the colleagues from the right who say, oh, they want to build high-rise apartments.
Right.
No one actually is promoting high-rise apartments outside of the city centre where there are already high-rise apartments which work very well.
Sure.
So there's quite a dishonest conversation going on about intensity. There are some really good models of high-quality, medium-density housing, and having those in a flexible way that provides multi-generational housing, it's just not on the government's agenda.
And the other thing too is that there's an assumption that all this growth must come to Auckland, and it's absolutely inevitable, and nothing can be done to change it. Well, I don't buy that. I think that we have a country which is becoming unbalanced in terms of its population. More and more, over a third, piling into Auckland, especially new immigrants, and the rest of the country is kind of hollowing out. We have a surplus of infrastructure in some parts of provincial New Zealand, and we have a chronic shortage of it in Auckland, and in order to pay for that, it's going to be a huge cost on taxpayers and ratepayers, but there's no appetite amongst you know, the central government or the bureaucracy to try and do something to incentivise people to go to other parts of New Zealand and develop New Zealand as a whole.
Sure. Question to both of you finally on this. Should the free market be left to decide house prices, or does it require an active government to be part of the equation?
I think we do need some intervention.
Yeah.
I think we need a comprehensive approach to that though. I know Auckland Council is looking at developing a strategic housing action plan. And the thing that's always coming up is the cost of consenting, when actually we know that the cost of consenting is a really small component. So we need to be very careful that this debate doesn't become all about the Resource Management Act as a barrier, and that it's actually about how do we create housing that works for people.
Yep. Should we leave it to the invisible hands of the free market, Mike?
Well, we don't now. There's no free market in housing right now. You know, as I said, we have a monopoly influence on building material. We have a monopoly in terms of regulation costs, and that's councils. They probably are too high, to be fair, speaking as a council person. We don't have a free market in housing. Not that I'm an advocate for the free market, but let's not kid ourselves here. People like Fletcher's would be terrified of an international free market.
Sure.
They are terrified of it. However, I believe that if we want to solve a housing problem, a housing shortage, inequality, we look at what worked in the past. And New Zealand was extremely successful back in the days of John A. Lee at solving a major housing problem in the 30s and 40s by state intervention, by a Ministry of Works, by a powered up housing at state advances and all the rest of it.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, in an extraordinary interview, John Key claims he has left New Zealand in a better place than he found it. Really? Question to both of you. New Zealand has 7.3% unemployment, 270,000 kids in poverty, and the highest level of inequality we've ever seen in New Zealand. How is this better, Julie?
Oh, well, I think it's better for John Key. And I think it's probably very much better for Stephen Joyce. But I think that who it's not better for is not just New Zealand as a whole, but also I think it's disproportionately affected women.
Right.
So one of the big announcements we've had in the last week, which has sadly gone largely under the radar, is the fact that the government has broken its promise on coming up with an effective long-term funding solution for Auckland Sexual Abuse Help, which runs a 24-hour right crisis line. They're probably going to have to close. They've been doing this work for over 30 years in Auckland. It's an essential service, and yet it seems to be a nice to have for John Key and other people in his government. It's just outrageous that they've twice now promised to resolve this issue and rolled over some more funding while they do that, and now there doesn't seem to be a rollover and they haven't resolved the issue. So
Auckland rape crisis have to hope on Hell Pizza. Is that where they've got to hope for their bloody funding?
Hopefully not. So it's a separate organisation from Rape Crisis, but the work that they do is just essential.
How is New Zealand better in 4 years of this national party?
He's partially right. It's better off for him, as Julie says, it's better off for him, for Stephen Joyce and for the party donors. It's better off for them, but for the rest of the country, for the environment, a whole lot of metrics, it isn't, the country isn't better than it was. You know, they gave themselves big tax breaks, and then they added on GST for the ordinary folk. You know, so it's better off for him and his supporters, but the country is worse off.
Quick question to both of you: the continuation of neoliberal ideas aren't making New Zealand better for anyone other than those with wealth. Is national strategy just spin now? I mean, you've seen Key do this a couple of times where it's all okay, not really a big problem. You saw him on The Nation last weekend. He was quite adamant that New Zealand is a far better place now. I mean, is it just spin?
Well, I suspect that they're quite heavily influenced by some of the stuff that's happened in the States, and there's some quite clear and I think very interesting research out of the States that shows that most people think they are in a higher earning bracket than they actually are.
Oh, okay.
And so people will often think, aspirationally, as the buzzword is, that they are in, say, the top 5%. So it's something like 25% of Americans think they're in the top 5% of income earners.
Really?
Yes, there's some quite interesting stuff like that. Oh. And I think that that is behind some of this stuff, is that the messages they're sending to a lot of New Zealanders are that if you're not well off, then you're the deserving poor, and you're being kept down by those bludgers on benefits. And also encouraging people to not identify as poor.
Right.
And so they're identifying as middle or upper class, and they're thinking, yeah, tax breaks, I'd get a tax break, when they totally wouldn't, and they won't have.
So we're just looking at spin now for the next 2 years, and it's all good and fine. And
I thought it might have been one of those gee shucks off the cuff remarks from Key, but if he's saying it deliberately, then it's fiendishly clever spin. You keep on saying that, and the people who are worse off think it's their fault. And the people who, and a lot of them may think they're better off and they're not. So I would say that's pretty smart advice from those offshore spin doctors that they use.
Let's wrap the show, ladies and gentlemen. The last word, Julie, your last word this week is?
I wanted to talk about the starting out wage, which is basically entrenching discrimination against young people and those who've been on a benefit for 6 months. And just to say that it's open for submissions at the moment. You can go to the parliamentary website, really easily make a submission. And we would not accept discrimination on the basis of gender. We would not accept it on the basis of ethnicity, sexual orientation, a whole raft of things. We should not accept it on age.
Mike, your final word this week is?
I want to talk about David Shearer because he's been criticised for lack of political experience, lack of ideas and so on, but everyone agrees he's a nice guy. Interestingly enough, this crisis, which has to be solved, there's a desperate need to solve it, could be solved by David Shearer resorting to his niceness. That may have an important role in politics right now, because I think David Cunliffe has to be brought back into the fold. The party can't have a division, and a hemorrhage like this going on and on to the election. They have to bring him back in. They have to do a deal. There has to be an understanding. There has to be reconciliation. And I think David Shearer's famous niceness may actually be the key to it.
Wise words. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. News that animals may have been abused during the making of The Hobbit come fast on the heels of a survey that showed many New Zealanders critical of the movie. The manufactured crisis at The Hobbit, where Key and Jackson sang in unison that it was all the actors' union's fault, turned out to be an utter falsehood once Peter Jackson's emails were released under the Official Information Act that showed it wasn't the actors' union who were the problem at all. I think New Zealanders felt that they had been conned when Key rewrote labour laws for Warner Brothers, and they turned a bit sour over Jackson as the constant promotion of his business started looking less patriotic and more cronyism. The anti-union hysteria dutifully whipped up by the mainstream media at the time was so ferocious you would need to go back to the 51 lockout for a recent example. The problems with basing New Zealand's entire marketing image on a semi-racist Aryan fantasy written by a potty English professor was never really considered. It's happened because Key and Jackson are mates, and because New Zealand needed to move away from 100% pure because Key's farmer buddies have polluted our rivers so much so that we are more 40% pure, 60% cow shit. New Zealand 100% Middle Earth animal abuse doesn't seem like an attractive tourism slogan now, does it? If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.